Good morning, everyone. We are almost ready to start this morning's issue forum. We're just going to wait. We have several other people who are signing into the session. So thank you for your patience. Okay, so it's 10 o'clock this morning, and it's my honor to welcome everyone to our local legislative issue forum, hosted by Senator Kathy Kemp, Representative Andrew Basenecker, and Representative Yaro Zokai. Today's session will focus on a very timely and important topic, immigrant rights. And we're honored to have our speaker today, Kaylee Leon, who is the North Regional Organizer for the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. My name is Beth Jager, and I will be your moderator for the next 60 minutes. Let me take just a brief moment to review our agenda today. After Kaylee's presentation, we will have a question and answer session that will be focused on today's topic of immigrant rights. You'll be able to ask your questions in one of two ways. You may either click on the chat button and type your question in, or if you prefer to ask your question live, then click on the react icon, and within that you will see the raised hand icon. Click on that, and I will see your virtual hand being raised. I'll call on you. Please remember to unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Then after your question is answered, please go back on mute so we can minimize background noise. Another thing I do want to note is that the chat function is open to everyone today so that everyone can read everybody's input into this discussion. You'll see right now in the chat that Kaylee has posted two resources for you about her organization's presentations on immigrant rights, and then information for an upcoming webinar on February 27th. So you may want to note that. And then one final request to all of you is to please ask your questions and offer your comments in a respectful manner so we can set a very positive and productive tone for our conversation this morning. So with that, Kaylee, it's my honor to welcome you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Awesome, thank you all. All right, I'm gonna start sharing my presentation now and get this ball rolling. All right, can I get some thumbs up to make sure everyone can see my screen? Awesome, let's go. All right, let's do this. All right, my name is Kaylee again, and I'm the North Region Organizer for the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. The CIRC was formed in 2002, so we've been around for a while, right? And I like to tell folks, like, me and CIRC were kind of the same age, basically. So it's awesome to see that CIRC has been around for so long, right? CIRC had such a positive experience on me growing up as a, undocumented child here in Colorado. So I'm so grateful for the work that they do and the work that they continue doing. And I'm grateful to be a part of it now as a young adult. So I'm super excited to give y'all a presentation. This is not relevant to y'all, but we do this for folks who need interpretation at times. All right. Few things before I get started. I'm not an attorney. I am 23. So if you guys have any legal questions, I unfortunately can't answer them as I don't want to be giving legal advice or information that is not correct, right? My purpose here is to just generally share information that is available to everyone. I usually, share this information with directly impacted folks. So it's important that I share correct information that, that is available, but we want to make sure that it is fully correct. So just a thing to note. All right, before we get started, we think it's important to talk about the history, right, of the immigrant rights movement and what that looked like, especially for me, who was growing up here in Colorado, right? In 2006, I remember it as one of the most anti-immigrant years. And frankly, it's been feeling like that recently. So a lot of folks don't know, and they associate the Show Me Your Papers law with Arizona, when in fact, it was actually Georgia and Colorado who were one of the first states to pass this law, right? And for those folks who don't know, it essentially required law enforcement agencies to report anyone that they suspected would be undocumented, right? So that brought forth a lot of racial profiling, and it brought a lot of fear among the undocumented community. I remember my parents didn't want to drive outside of Boulder County, where I grew up, right? Because of the fear of, not knowing how law enforcement would react, right? So in essence, in 2013, after a lot of pressure from the undocumented community and immigrant leaders, we were able to repeal this bill, right? By proving that it created a lot of untrust between law enforcement and the undocumented community. We shared stories of folks that were scared of calling, law enforcement, even if they were having an emergency, right? Or, any type of situation where they would need to call law enforcement, but instead they were scared because of their status, right? And so this was called the Community and Law Enforcement Trust Act of 2013, right? So again, because of the huge movement with immigrant rights at the time, SB 90, or the Show Me Your Papers bill, was repealed. Again, by showing that it broke trust between community and local law enforcement. So it's important for us to note that, right? Especially because this bill was recently reintroduced, right? And so we're actually going to show up as a community on, I think, this Tuesday, February 25th, to basically re-show that, right? We're just in a similar era where a lot of anti-immigrant bills are popping up. Even though 10 years ago, I guess over 10 years ago, we showed how much of a divisive and untrusting, environment this bill created. So some more protections for folks to know that exist for undocumented folks here in the state is one, that ICE can't make arrests in or outside any courthouse. It's actually illegal in the state of Colorado for ICE to use this tactic. It's a really fairly common tactic that ICE uses across different states that don't have this protection. So in Colorado, we decided to pass this, right, to make sure that folks who needed to go for an asylum court date, right, for any immigration process, or even something as simple as a traffic, incident, right, to go to their courthouse without fearing that ICE would be there waiting for them. Another thing is that probation officers are prohibited from sharing information with ICE. Again, this was something that we had heard from folks that was happening. And so in order to stop this, right, and to respond to what we were hearing from community, this was also passed. Another thing is that folks actually have to be informed of their right to refuse an interview with ICE when they're in jail custody, right? That's another tactic. People were pressured into interviews with ICE, to talking with ICE, right? So we like folks to know that they actually have the right to refuse that if they're in jail custody in the state of Colorado. Also, if you post bond for someone who is then deported, you're entitled to a full refund. All right. And then this next bill is super important, and we really like to emphasize this with the community, as it's a bill that protects against criminal extortion based on your immigration status. So for those who don't know, it's illegal in Colorado to threaten to report someone's immigration status, to force them to give money, to do something illegal, or to stop them from reporting a crime. Super important for folks to know this, right? Because a lot of the time, especially some of the new incoming immigrants that have just arrived, right, they don't know, right? And it's important for them to realize that they shouldn't be threatened in any way for their immigration status. Also, I forgot to mention at first, but above here is a little link that y'all can look up. That is basically our Know Your Rights hub on our website. We have all of this info on there, including the recordings that were posted in the chat of our Know Your Rights trainings that we've done, and also a lot of good information for folks. It's just a good website to check out for us. So a lot of this you can find on there. All right. In terms of immigration detention, police departments can't hold someone for ICE beyond their scheduled release date. This is also a tactic that we knew that was being used between law enforcement and ICE. So this was basically passed in order to stop that and to give folks a little bit of a protection, right, with ICE, and to make sure that folks weren't scared, right, that they would be taken away by ICE immediately. Also, IGSA contracts are prohibited in the state of Colorado. essentially what these contracts do is they allow local jails to rent beds to ICE, essentially to expand their immigration detention, right? So this is another thing that we heard that was happening across the state, right? And so that is illegal in the state of Colorado. And again, like I mentioned earlier, police can't arrest you based solely on your immigration status. Law enforcement has no real need to ask anyone for their immigration status. That is ICE's job, right? Like federal agencies, not law enforcement, right? They're enforcing laws in terms of the criminal sense and laws that exist in your locality, the state, right? They have nothing to do with immigration enforcement. So we want to make sure that folks know that, especially when it comes to licenses, right? For folks that don't know, undocumented folks in the state of Colorado are able to access a license. It's a special type of license that essentially says that it's not a federal ID, but it is valid in the state of Colorado. So we like to remind folks to get their license, especially with this next thing that I'm going to talk about. It's important for them to do so, right? In case they're stopped at a traffic stop of some sort. It's important for them to know that they can show their license, right? Without fear of being asked for their immigration status in any way. It's valid in the state of Colorado. All right. Speaking of data privacy, so this was actually passed because CERC had heard that the DMV had been sharing information with ICE, right? And so in order to stop this and to give immigrant folks a bit of an extra security measure and make sure that their information was safe and they weren't scared of getting their license, we passed this data privacy bill, right? Essentially stating that state agencies like the DMV can't share personal identifying information with ICE unless, of course, ICE presents a warrant of some sort, right? This also applies to third-party entities who can only access state databases if they sign an agreement not to share information with ICE. So again, state agencies can only collect immigration status when it is required by state or federal law. Super important, right? Again, we like to remind folks that they can get their license, right? That they can do and make sure that it's a safety thing, right? We want to make sure that folks are able to identify themselves in the state of Colorado and they're able to drive without a problem, right? All right, so a little bit of a review and some new things that I like to mention. ICE, again, can't make arrests by courthouses. It is illegal in the state of Colorado. It prohibits the civil arrest of a person who is present in or about a court of law, also while traveling, attending, or returning from some type of court proceeding. So it's a pretty extensive coverage, and we want to make sure, because again, this is a tactic that ICE tend to use a lot. So again, driver's licenses, they're available for undocumented folks in the state of Colorado. That was because of a law called SB 251 back in, I think, 2013. But in essence, any undocumented person could get a license, and it's a lot easier. It took 10 years, but it's a lot easier at this time. I remember back in the day with my parents, they had to drive all the way to Colorado Springs to go get their license because it was one of 5 offices that could process licenses like that. That's no longer the case, thankfully. You can go to any DMV and get your license. And also now the requirements have changed. So qualifying immigrants in Colorado can apply for a driver's license after 30 days, only 30 days of having resided in Colorado. Again, this will start in March of 2025. And there are a lot of organizations that help folks apply for this type of license in case they want some help. But it's a lot easier than it used to be. There used to be a lot more requirements back when this first started. Also, little thing that I feel like a lot of folks don't know, but there's an unemployment fund for undocumented immigrants in the state of Colorado. It's not using federal funds, it's using state funds, right? So Colorado is actually the first state to offer expansion of unemployment benefits for undocumented immigrants who qualify, right? It's called the Benefit Recovery Fund. And if anyone wants more info on that, I'm happy to share more of that. I can type my email in the chat and I can share those flyers with y'all if you know of anyone who is needing that. Again, there are no more IGSA contracts in the state of Colorado. So this basically terminated all IGSA contracts, which were those that allowed local county jails to rent beds to ICE, which was effective of January of last year. This also prevented the formation and operation of any new private ICE facilities in the state of Colorado. So of course, it doesn't impact the current one that we have, the only one in Aurora, which is the only private ICE detention center in the state of Colorado. Also, for folks that don't know, undocumented students can go to college. That is one reason I was able to go to college. But one thing that made it easier for us was the Asset Bill of 2013. So in essence, it allowed folks like me to get in-state tuition, because before that, undocumented students would have to pay as if they were international students or out-of-state students, right? So even if you had graduated school like me here in the state of Colorado and lived your whole life here, you would have to have paid as an international student. That is no longer the case and hasn't been the case since 2013. Also, undocumented students, this is relatively new, can access state financial aid. This is called the CAFSA, just because we're barred, undocumented students are barred from getting from getting help from FAFSA, the federal version of this. So instead, Colorado created their own version with state funds called CASPA. So that's also available for undocumented students. We also have something called Cover All Coloradans, which is a Medicaid lookalike program that actually started just this year, January of, it's been, oh my God, we're almost at the end of February, but started in January this year, which essentially provides coverage for low-income undocumented minors, so anyone under the age of 18, no matter their immigration status, and any pregnant person in the state of Colorado. It actually covers their pregnancy term and a year after their pregnancy. Again, if you want more info, I'll put my email in the chat so I can give y'all more of the eligibility requirements and how to apply. All right, so talk a little bit about those protections. I think it's super important, especially with the way that immigration is being talked about at the national level, right? There's a lot of criminalizing, dehumanization of my community, right, at the federal level. So it's important for folks to know that there's still a layer of protection, when it comes to state laws in Colorado. Also want folks to know that there's people fighting, right? And like there's spaces like this where we're sharing information about how to protect themselves, but also we want folks to know that there's people fighting constantly. And that Colorado's not going to give up, essentially. So, all right. I don't know how shy this group is today, as I've been talking the whole time, but I would like to ask y'all if anyone knows the difference between the police department, the sheriff's department, the state patrol, and ICE. The reason we ask this, especially with directly impacted folks, is a lot of them are new to this country, right? So they might not be familiar with how law enforcement works in this country, right? We also want to make sure that folks know how to identify local law enforcement from ICE. We've been getting a lot of calls to our corn line, which I'll share the number at the end, but it's our rapid response line, right? You can call if you see ICE. Folks have been calling that because they're not familiar maybe with the vehicles that ICE drives, or they're not familiar with how law enforcement operates, so they're scared and they're calling, they think that they see ICE when in fact it's just law enforcement. So we tend to ask this to community. I don't know if anyone's brave enough to unmute or to put in the chat what the difference is here.
I don't see anyone, Kaylee, so maybe you can help us with the
Let's do it, yeah. All right, so here we have some of the logos so people are able to identify them, right? Super important for people to be able to visualize these. But police departments, I think as most of us know, they're accountable to your local community. They cover your town, municipality. So if you're Fort Collins, that's going to be Fort Collins PD, right? Versus if you're in Boulder, that's going to be Boulder PD, right? The sheriff's department, they cover the county and the jail, right? So that's like Larimer County, Boulder County, things like that. And they serve official documents like those that enforce evictions. State Patrol, of course, they cover the highways across the state. That's like I-25, I-70. So if you're speeding, they're the ones there, right? To make sure that you're not. And then we have ACE, right? Which we like to explain as the difference, right? Police departments, sheriff's department, state patrols, they all enforce like Colorado law, right? They're the ones accountable to our Colorado community. ICE, on the other hand, is a federal agency, right? So they have nothing to do with any local laws. They can't act like police officers. They can't act like local law enforcement. They are only there to enforce immigration, right? They're also fairly new, right? They're younger than me. They were established in 2003, which is crazy to me, right? But again, it's a federal agency, right? They're not accountable for communities and only enforce federal immigration law. So that's it. That's what ICE is limited to. All right. And here's a quick little slide that we have so folks are able to identify ICE. Again, we want to make sure that folks are, not panicking, right, or spreading unnecessary panic. We've seen a lot of posts on Facebook of people posting and reposting unverified ICE sightings. And what those do, because they're not verified, they just cause panic, right? And we want to make sure that folks know what a confirmed ICE sighting looks like versus not confirmed, right? Because at the end of the day, our folks still have to take their kids to school. They still have to go to work. They still have to, continue their lives. They can't just simply put their lives on pause. And that's what a lot of these unverified ICE sightings have been doing. They've been causing a lot of misinformation and spreading unnecessary panic, right? So it's important for folks to know how to identify ICE. So ICE operates under various names and can wear different uniforms, or in some cases, no uniform at all. Sometimes they'll show up with normal clothes, right? So it's important for folks to have ICE identify themselves or call the line, as a lot of we're called confirmers, but we're trained to be able to interact with law enforcement, to ask them to identify themselves, right? To maybe get their business card, which I learned is something new that most police officers have and ICE agents have, is now a little business card. So in order to basically confirm their presence, right? But here we see immigration and customs enforcement, or the general ICE uniform, right? Usually we'll say ICE police, something like that, right? On their vest, on their jacket, something like that. They also, Homeland Security Investigations is also able to enforce immigration. And they have usually HSI somewhere on there, right? Police HSI, something like that. So folks also know, they also, this we'll mostly see it around the border area, but there's Custom and Border Protection. They're usually in some kind of green uniform. Even their cars have sometimes green on them, but it'll say Border Patrol on there. So again, it's important for folks to know how to differentiate these and know what ICE looks like. Again, to stop, unnecessary panic, and to make sure that folks are informed, right? And they know when ICE is actually there. All right, vehicles, super important, right? Because usually that's the first thing you'll see before you even see an ICE officer, right? So they utilize a range of vehicles, including both marked and unmarked, which makes it difficult, right? Their cars mostly consist of American-made vehicles, so you won't see a Toyota, anything like that, right? But on here, you'll see a picture of the Border Patrol. This is kind of what their cars look like. Sometimes it'll be a white car with simply a green slash that says Border Patrol. You'll see here U.S. Customs and Border Protection. That's also a car that they'll use. Here you see HSI, right? On this, it's more of a military style vehicle that they'll use. And here is a example of a unmarked car that ICE used in one of the raids recently here in Colorado. Okay. All right, the Constitution, super important, right? And I'm sure most of us are familiar with it. We either studied it in school at some point, hopefully, right? So we're pretty familiar with this document, but we like to teach folks, again, if they're new or they just haven't, had this education. But it was created by the founding fathers, right, of the United States. It basically sets up the laws, it sets up the government, and it also protects the rights of people in the US. Of course, these rights are called amendments, right? We hear about them constantly, the First Amendment, the 14th Amendment, we hear them constantly, right? There's 27 amendments, so we won't talk about all of them, of course, that would be insane. So we only teach the three, right? The three most important when it comes to interacting with law enforcement or when it comes to interacting with ICE, right? So that's the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. Basically what we dive into and what we explain to folks. And again, really important, the Constitution protects everyone regardless of their immigration status. I can't emphasize this enough. And that's probably the number one thing that I want folks to take away when I give these to directly impacted community members. It's the fact that the Constitution protects everyone. Doesn't matter if they don't have status, how long they've been here, it protects you, right? As long as you're in the country, the Constitution protects you, right? And that was kind of the point, right, when the Constitution was made. All right, a little deep dive, and I'm sure a lot of us are familiar, at least with the Fifth Amendment, right? We hear it constantly. We've seen a criminal show of some sort, right? At least I have. We hear it constantly, right? But to start, the Fourth Amendment, and of course, this gets tricky, this gets complicated. That's why we advise folks to have an attorney with them, especially if you feel like you've had an unlawful arrest by ICE. Super important to record those, and I'll go into details about that and what that could look like. But again, super important because the Fourth Amendment may be the one that ICE usually breaks for the most part, right? But what it says is to arrest someone, frisk someone, or search their property, that being their house, their car, something pertaining to private property. Authorities have to have probable cause, and we'll go into what that means, right? I feel like we've heard that a lot. Again, this gets tricky. So have an attorney on hand when it comes to what could be an unlawful arrest, right? That breaks the Fourth Amendment. It's just better to have an attorney on hand. The Fifth Amendment, that's your right to remain silent, right? we like to teach folks, well, at least I do, that we have 5 fingers, right? And we can use these to silence ourselves, right? So that's a great way for folks to kind of remember the Fifth Amendment, especially if English isn't their first language, right? Things can get complicated when, you're not understanding what the officers are saying, what they're requesting. So these trainings are kind of a good way for folks to familiarize themselves with how the process could look like and what they should do. Speaking of like language barriers, we have these little cards that we are passing out to directly impacted community. It's basically the little red cards, which I feel like a lot of us know, right? It's the same thing. These are just the ones that we make with the rapid response number on here for folks to be able to call and a space for them to write their lawyer's number. So these are just a great way for folks if they're ever interacting with ICE and they don't want to talk to them, right, at all, or they don't speak the language, they can hand these cards, which essentially is saying like, I'm enforcing the Fourth, the Fifth, and the Sixth, basically, to kind of prevent that language barrier. But all right, going back to the Sixth Amendment, this is the right to know the charges against an individual. This applies to law enforcement and ICE alike, right? All of these do, right? ICE is not immune from these, right? They still have to respect all of them. But in essence, you have the right to know what you're being charged with, right? Like law enforcement or ICE can't just arrest you without you knowing what you're being charged for, right? This also applies to due process, right? You have the right to an attorney. This gets tricky, especially in the immigration sense, right? Because immigration, as much as, folks are being criminalized, it actually doesn't exist in the criminal courts, right? It exists in the civil sense. So because of that, immigrants aren't given an attorney, right? Because if you're in the criminal court system, right? If you're low income and you require an attorney, the state can give you one, right? You can be provided some type of legal representation through the state. That's not the case when it comes to immigration, right? Because it exists in the civil sense. It's a federal system, right? They don't hand you, legal representation or an attorney of any sense. So that makes it really difficult for folks. I know recently it was in the news that the Trump administration had just taken away the right for minors, right? Because for those who don't know, there are babies, right, that have to represent themselves sometimes, right? Which is inhumane, it's ridiculous, but because they're not appointed an attorney. So organizations like Remain fought that really hard. If you're not familiar with Remain, it's a Rocky Mountain Advocacy Immigration Network, and they are amazing. They provide pro bono attorneys for folks going through the deportation process, right? So they're amazing. And they're kind of the folks that try to fill in the gap, right? Because again, immigrants are not given an attorney. They have to find theirs. All right. Little spiel. All right, back to probable cause. Again, I advise folks if you, especially if you're a directly impacted person, if you feel like there's been like unlawful, detention or anything like that, again, have an attorney, but probable cause essentially refers to the requirement that police, and again, this also applies to ICE, need to have an adequate reason to arrest someone, conduct a search, seize property related to an alleged crime, right? So police need relative evidence. They can either see that, right? Some type of evidence of a crime being committed to initiate an investigation. Again, this comes from the Fourth Amendment. A major exception to the probable cause requirement for many searches is consent. We especially teach this for folks, especially when it comes to ICE, right? If ICE knocks on your door, and unfortunately we won't have time to do scenarios, usually with directly impacted folks, we do different scenarios that kind of walk them through what to do, right? If ICE knocks on your door, if ICE stops you in public, super important, right? Especially when it comes to private property. So we teach folks not to open the door at all, because if you do, opening the door sometimes invites ICE in. They take that as consent, that you're letting them go into your house and search your home, right? So we advise folks not to open the door, right? And ask them for a valid, judicially signed search warrant, right? Super important. And we'll walk through what that looks like and what to look for. But again, super important, because consent, if you allow, like, that's law enforcement or especially ICE, if you tell them, yes, you can search my house, yes, you can search my car, you've basically given up that right? So we like to make sure that folks know that consent is very important, right? If they ask you, you can say no, you can refuse that. All right. Warrants. Again, this gets a little tricky, right? But in essence, we like to tell folks, don't open the door so you can ask ICE to pass usually, again, ICE won't have an arrest or search warrant. These are mostly when it comes to law enforcement, right? ICE, for the most part, won't have a judicially signed search warrant. So we tell folks most of the time, like, they're not going to be able to come in, right? Because they don't have this. but you can ask them to pass some type of warrant under the door, right? Again, if it doesn't fit, you can ask them to hold up to a window, right? Or some type of mail slot, something that allows you to not open the door and just receive it, because you are entitled to a copy of it, to analyze it, to see if it's a valid warrant. All right, for an arrest warrant, again, ICE most likely doesn't have this. This is mostly law enforcement, right? But it's for one person. It has to include the full name of the person you are looking for as it appears on their birth certificate, right? Their legal name. It also has to include the current date. And of course, make sure that it's signed by a judge. We get a lot of questions like what that looks like, right? Like, how are you going to know if a judge signed it? So, especially for folks who don't speak the language, right? Or who maybe aren't familiar with English all that well, we ask folks, at least I'm asking folks to memorize the word judge. Super important, right? Because that's going to be your key. If it says judge and there's a signature next to it, a judge signed it, right? So I'm asking folks to memorize that word, especially if, again, English isn't their first language, right? A search warrant, again, this is to search property, some type of private property, right? Your car, your house, something like that. Has to include the address of the house. They want to search what exactly they're looking for, the current date, and it also has to be signed by a judge. All right, it's an example of a search warrant. I'll zoom in here, but you can see actually has the address and it has the description of the house, and it has what they're looking for, and it has the date and the word judge. Oh my goodness, I don't know what happened. Ooh, I went a little fast. Okay, we're back. As the judge, the little word judge, right? And the signature, right? So that's how we know that it's a valid search warrant. And in that case, they can come in and search your house, right? And again, most of the time, ICE won't have these. So I'll show y'all what ICE tries to use to get into people's house, because ICE can be very deceptive. They tend to intimidate folks, and they tend to use their power, right, to arrest people, right, to make them self-incriminate. So just so folks know. Here's an example of an arrest warrant. It has a list of charges for the arrest, of course, the full name of the person, their physical description, their date of birth, and if it applies to the person, their social security number. It also has the date, of course, for authorized arrest. And here it's a little clearer, the word judge, right? So the judge's signature is right there. It's a valid arrest warrant. All right, this is especially the one on the left is what ICE tries to use to get into people's homes, right? Sometimes when someone will ask them, do you have a warrant? ICE will hand this to them and try to pass it as a valid judicial warrant, right, to search their home. Again, this is not valid. People shouldn't open the door if ICE shows up with this. This is called an administrative warrant or a warrant for arrest of alien. So here, as you can see, it doesn't have the signature of a judge. Instead, it has a space for signature of authorized immigration officer. So nowhere on here is it signed by a judge. So we are advising people to not open the door when it comes to this, right? Because again, nothing on here allows them to search their house, to come into their house at all, right? This is just their warrant to enforce immigration. They can't use this when it comes to a private space because you're allowed to say no to them searching your house. When it comes to public spaces, it can get tricky, right? Because they can't enforce this, right? They can't have this warrant for someone to arrest them, right? So what we advise folks is to ask, like, especially in public, because again, public versus private is very different, right? With public spaces, we ask undocumented folks to, if ICE does know your name, right? A lot of the time they do, and they'll try to intimidate folks or try to talk more and self-incriminate. So we ask folks to ask them, have I done something wrong? They can't say anything. Okay. Am I free to leave? No, they won't let you, right? Or sometimes they will, right? Depending on what's happening. So we ask folks to just stay silent, right? Because they usually ask questions like, where were you born? Do you have a license? Do you have, papers to work? Things like that. And what they're trying to look for is trying to find some probable cause to arrest you. This is, again, referring to ICE, right? So we ask folks not to answer those questions, because if you do answer, like, where were you born? Now you have the burden of proof to prove that, right? To show some type of way that you're here legally. So we just ask folks to stay silent, use their Fifth Amendment when it comes to public spaces. So as to not self-incriminate, and again, call their attorney, or have someone call their attorney, or call the rapid response line. But again, back to private spaces, yes. So ICE will try to use these to try to get into the house. They'll also try to use this. I haven't seen this. We've mostly been seeing this administrative warrant. But this is called an immigration detain or hold request. Again, there's no judge's signature here, and it says request, right? We have that underlined here. It's not an obligation, it's a request, right? So don't open the door to ICE. So these, like you saw, they're not signed by a judge. They don't create probable cause. They're requests, they're not mandatory, and can be refused by local government unless accompanied by, of course, a criminal warrant, some type of signed warrant. Okay, and these are what we're asking folks. I know a lot of community members have been printing these and putting them right on their door, right? Because especially if ICE knocks on your door, you're going to be panicking, right? It's a scary situation for undocumented folks, right? So we're asking people to print these. These are on our website. Again, it's that link that I showed y'all, and I can put that in the chat. But this is one of the PDFs that we're asking folks to print. It walks through basically what I just talked about, what makes a valid search warrant versus not a valid search warrant, right? Here's an example of that administrative warrant that I showed y'all, and here's the example of a valid search warrant, right, signed by a judge. So it's just nice for folks to have, and it also has their rights here and the rapid response line right here. So just a good resource for folks to have. All right, we're going to talk about something fairly new called expedited removal. Well, so previously, ICE and CPB could only use expedited removal against people who were within 100 miles of the border, right? So that border area and within 14 days of their arrival, right? So it was for people who had just come into the country. But now, because of the Trump administration, the government can use expedited removal anywhere in the country against any undocumented person, right? And what is expedited removal? So it essentially allows the government to quickly deport someone they believe to be undocumented without ever seeing a judge. This is crazy to me, right? They have no due process. This person would essentially just be taken, right, and quickly deported without even having the chance to fight, right, their case, to have some type of a way to ensure that they find some type of relief to stay in the country, right? Because they wouldn't be seeing a judge, they would just be deported quickly, right? There are some exceptions to this. The first is if the person entered with parole or a visa and they overstayed their visa, right? So we're asking folks, and we'll talk about how folks can prepare, but essentially, again, if you came here with a visa, and even if you overstayed it, or you came in with parole, you are not, you're basically, expedited removal can't be used against you. Also, if you have been here for more than 2 years, they also can't use expedited removal. So what we're asking folks to prepare is that they carry evidence of being here for longer than 2 years, right? That can be some type of mail that you've received to your home address with, of course, a postmark, a signed lease, something like that. Of course, that has a date and your address of some sort, church, school records, something like that. Again, that includes your address. Of course, carry copies. Don't carry your originals. We don't want to risk you losing those. And we're also advising folks not to carry their foreign identification documents, right? That could be a foreign passport of any sense, a consular ID, something like that, right? Because it could be used against them. Especially if you're recently got your green card, for example, right? Or some type of legal status, carry that, right? Especially if you fear you might be racially profiled or you may be caught up in a raid, just get to bring those, right? Again, I don't think this applies to every citizen, right? This is mostly for folks who fear that they may be racially profiled. If you have been pending asylum application or any other case or appeal in an immigration court, bring proof of that with you, right? Because that could also stop you from being removed expeditedly. Just a little note, we believe expedited removal shouldn't apply to anyone who entered on parole or a visa, but again, can't be certain because this is so new, right, as to how DHS will apply this rule, right? But we encourage folks who entered, again, with that visa or that parole, even if they overstayed, to carry evidence of that entry, right, as to stop expedited removal from happening. If you haven't been here for more than 2 years, you've been here for a year or so, or you didn't come in with a visa or any type of thing like that, you can say that you are scared of going to your country, that you have some type of valid fear of going back, right? Because then what happens is you can be put into an interview, right, to analyze and try to validate, that's not a word, to validate if you have some type of real fear of going back to your country, right? And that's a way to see an immigration judge and to fight your case, right? So again, if those options, the having a visa doesn't apply to you, or some type of parole that you enter the country with, or that you have some type of pending application, or you have you've been here for over 2 years, say that you're scared, right? You have some type of valid fear of being in the country. Again, this is all new. The way that DHS hasn't usually applied this, right? So this is all completely new. So lawyers are observing, they're trying to see. Again, this is just a way to prepare that we've been told by attorneys to tell folks. All right, the Laken-Riley Act. It's been in the news, right, a lot, but essentially this new law mandates the federal detention of any undocumented immigrant who is charged of theft, burglary, assaulting a law enforcement officer, or any crime that causes death or serious bodily injury. Again, this means that immigrants just charged, doesn't mean that they have to be proven guilty, anything like that, with these crimes could be transferred to ICE without any due process. So again, this is super scary, right? You have no way of fighting your case. There's nothing here that would outline due process, right? It's just if you're just even being charged, right? So that could be like an undocumented, mother might be accused of stealing something, right? And without even being, found guilty or, they're just charged with this, they can be transferred immediately to ICE without any due process. So it's super scary. Again, though, in Colorado, we have policies that are aimed at limiting ICE cooperation despite what's happening at the federal level. We want to emphasize this, right? All those protections that I talked about earlier, they're still in place in Colorado. All right, we're almost at the end. So I'll try to speed up a little bit. ICE schools, super important. We've gotten a lot of questions, especially from teachers, right? Because of this revocation of the sensitive locations, ruling. So this used to be an Obama era thing. Again, it was taken away by the Trump administration. But even with that, ICE agents still have to present some type of warrant, right? So school officials are not required to authorize agents to enter non-public areas of the premises to locate any specific individuals. Again, this is because given the security measures now most taken in schools, most of the time as a visitor, you can't get past the lobby in a school, right? So you can't access, classrooms, anything like that. That same thing applies to ICE agents, right? So any interior part, especially when it comes to K through 12 schools, is a non-public area. It gets a little more complicated with colleges. I can say that places like dorms are considered private areas, right? Something that requires like a key to get in would be a private area in a college. Again, it gets a little tricky. So each school has their own protocol. I've talked to a couple, UNC, CSU, and CU. They kind of all have their own protocols. Again, I like to remind folks that undocumented students do have the right to be in school, right? This is because of a Supreme Court case called Plyer versus Doe. It's the right to public education regardless of immigration status. This applies to K through 12 education in the country. All right, I'll try to do this a little quicker, but given that schools are no longer considered sensitive locations, here are some protocols to follow. So let's say you're a front desk staff, right? You can immediately contact the district's point person for assistance in assuring an appropriate and consistent response to an enforcement action. Even if school administrators has concerns, maintain a professional demeanor, right? Upon the arrival of ICE agents, you can request their name, their badge or ID number, their business card, right? Telephone number, something like that. And again, you can ask folks to stay silent, right? And to ask for an attorney, wait for an attorney to get there, or you can call the rapid response line. Again, if the agents don't have some type of court order, FERPA protects the information, right? The records of students, right? And for the most part, school districts won't have their immigration status for a kid, right? It's not something they ask for. So, but again, because of FERPA, they can't access these records without prior consent from the student's parents, or if they're over 18, from the consent of the student. So folks are encouraging schools to take on what are called safe zone policies, right? Encourage schools to adopt these. It prevents the collection of students' immigration status, establishes clear procedures for handling ICE enforcement actions, reinforces public schools must remain welcoming to all students, and trains all school staff on how to respond to immigration enforcement situations, right? Super important. And I know a lot of school districts have already taken this on they've been training their staff, and they've been finding ways to protect students if ICE ever does show up. And we'll talk about this in a later slide, but first, healthcare spaces, super important, right? What changed? Essentially, healthcare facilities are no longer protected as sensitive locations, again, like we talked about. This is a DHS internal policy. It's not a law. What happens now is ICE can enter waiting rooms and other public areas, but again, can't access patient rooms or private medical spaces without a judicial warrant. So again, this private versus public, super important for folks to understand. So if ICE does arrive at some type of healthcare facility, they can ask for identification, right? Again, it's that name, that badge number, that business card. They can request a judicial warrant, again, ensure that it's signed by a judge, list the correct facility address, and specifies areas they're allowed to search. And you can direct ICE agents to the legal or administrative point of contact, right? And don't provide patient records or immigration status unless required by a court order. Again, that's protected under HIPAA. All right. Some protocols you could have is ensure that front desk staff know the protocols for handling ICE, create private intake areas to protect patient confidentiality, and encourage patients to seek care without fear. Health is a human right, right? Just because you don't have status in this country doesn't mean you can't go to a hospital. Although that I know has been a fear that I've been hearing from community, they're scared, right? Because they don't have status in the way that just the large amount of anti-immigrant rhetoric. All right. Super quickly, you have the right to record and document anything, right? Of course, you should be careful of the way you go about this, right? Let the officer, the ICE agent know that you're recording if you do feel unsafe, right? Because you have the right to do so. ICE will tend to intimidate folks out of recording, right? But we want to make sure that folks know that they can. Of course, this doesn't apply to courts or inside jails, right? But if you're out in public, you're a bystander watching, an ICE agent, right? You can record. Again, this is super important because what this does is provides evidence that it was an unlawful arrest, right? And this can be used for the persons, the victims, immigration attorney, right? Use that to fight if it was an unlawful arrest. Again, a tip, if an ICE agent does tell you as a bystander to take 2 steps like back, right? Because you're interfering, do so, right? Record yourself taking 2 steps back, right? And make sure that you're recording that you're obliging what they're saying, right? But still, that doesn't mean you have to stop recording. All right, super quickly, I like to remind folks that even if they're detained by ICE, there's still some type of hope, right? Again, with the due process, it gets a little complicated now because of the new rulings, but if you do have the chance to talk to an immigration judge, right, make sure you have an attorney because this just increases your chances of being able to stay in the country, right? Someone who actually knows how to work the immigration system, right? So it's important for folks to be able to have some type of legal representation. Remain is a great one, right? There's a hotline that people can call if they have been detained, right, to get some pro bono attorney. They're an amazing organization. Again, being in the detention process could mean finding relief that you might not have been able to access before you were detained, right? Without being in detention, there are very limited ways to get citizenship. As for me, that's the same thing, right? I have very limited ways for me to actually get citizenship. The only one right now that I see is getting married, and I'm 23. I'm not trying to do that, right? So if I were to be detained, though, that would open up some more venues, especially if I have an immigration attorney with me. All right. Super important for folks to know, right? We can't prevent the way ICE is going to behave, right? Especially now, we know they've broken a lot of these laws, right? And have created a lot of unconstitutional arrests. But it's important for folks to know these, right? Because it's a way to defend that arrest, right? It's a way to know, right? It can be a protection thing, right? You know that they can't come in. You can tell them you can't come in unless you have a warrant, right? Super important for folks to know these things, even if ICE, behaves a certain way. All right, finally, here is the rapid response number. Here's the Facebook page where the Colorado Rapid Response Network is posting confirmed ICE sightings and unconfirmed ICE sightings, right? So folks know to stay away from an area or that it's safe to go to an area, right? So I would check out their page. And again, I would keep it respectful, right? There's been a lot of hate comments on there, but again, this is just a safety thing for community. So it's a great resource, and we want to make sure that it stays respectful. Here's the number, 844-864-8341. And the Facebook, of course, is just Colorado Rapid Response Network. If you type that into Facebook, you'll find their page. I don't think we have time for this, but essentially, if you know a family who is undocumented and they want to have some type of stability, I would encourage them to fill out a family preparedness packet. Here's a QR code for it. I'll keep it up. It essentially walks them through what to do, right? Who to leave their kids with. These are super, intense things to think about, right? But it's just best in case, they are detained, their spouse is detained, right? So who to leave those kids with, who to leave like your rent to, your bills, all those important things, right? In case you do have to go, right? So super important for folks to fill this out. So I'll leave it on this for a second for folks to take pictures, but all right, I think we can start asking questions now.
Well, Kaylee, first of all, I want to thank you for a very informative presentation. I know that I certainly learned a lot. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and Kaylee, I'm also hoping that by the end of the session, you can type in your email and your website link into the chat so people have that as a resource.
Yes, here is the QR code here on the left is our Know Your Rights Hub on our website. So if you scan that, you'll go directly to our website.
Okay.
And on this end is an amazing Know Your Rights app created by NACASEC, which is a national immigrants organization. And they have Know Your Rights info, basically what I taught, and just a little clearer on your phone in Spanish, English, Korean, and a bunch of different languages. So.
Great, thank you. Let me remind our attendees, you can now ask your questions via chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. And like I said, we have about 10 minutes for those questions. So Kaylee, this came in earlier in your presentation from Patricia Olson, who is asking, can someone who is in the US legally, but does not qualify for student loans or tuition, can they have access to CAFSA?
I think CAFSA is primarily for undocumented students, right? Because essentially they can't access FAFSA. So, yeah, I don't know. I would look up the CAFSA's requirements, eligibility from my understanding, is mostly for undocumented students, right? Or they have DACA, something like that. So yeah, I would look it up. You can find it. You type in CAFSA, you'll probably find it. And there's a Colorado State website where you can find eligibility requirements.
If I can help with that,
Awesome.
FAFSA is a federal program that allows you to apply for student loans. CAFSA would have the same requirements, except only you must be a documented person. So you can't get CAFSA and FAFSA, you can get either or.
Thank you, Senator. Jared McLaughlin is asking, does university campus law enforcement like CSU PD fall under police departments for the purpose of Colorado law?
I mean, if I would want some help from y'all, but from my understanding, they are basically law enforcement, right? Especially when it comes to like a locality. So they work together with Fort Collins law enforcement. I don't know if someone has a better answer to that.
I can maybe chime in there. I believe they would be subject to the same restrictions or requirements of our municipal law enforcement as their post-certified officers in the state of Colorado.
Great, thank you. Ashley Weber is asking, Kaylee, you had shown some cards earlier in your presentation that people can give to officers if necessary.
Yes.
Do you know where people can get those?
Yep. Here, I can put the link in, but it's also on our website to order some. I ask y'all to be patient with us as we've had so many orders that we're trying to fulfill. Again, we're a small team. We're like 12 people across the state. So I'd ask y'all to be patient with us, but I can put the link in for ordering here. Let me do that real quick.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to stop sharing. That was, anyway, but I can answer the next question as I look this up.
Okay. Well, the next question is actually a comment from Kate Brady. Thanking you, Kaylee, for your time and expertise. I feel much more informed.
Awesome. Good.
The next question is from Don McIntyre. Kaylee, has ICE been in Fort Collins, and how are you personally protected?
Yeah, ICE has been in Fort Collins. We have had some confirmed sightings. Again, you can visit that website, the Facebook page, right? You can just look it up, Colorado Rapid Response Network, to find out if ICE has been here, right? But again, asking folks, right? If you're in your car, stay in your car, ask for a warrant. If you're outside of your car, stay silent, use that right, call the rapid response line. Again, what we do is we can either send someone to confirm the ICE sighting, or we can have someone on the phone with you, stay on there, telling you about your rights, reminding you what to do, right? We have seen that it's been working, right? Even the Border Czar has been saying, right, that it's been working and it's making their job more difficult, right? But we have personally been seeing how it's working in Colorado. Folks have been able to not, fight off unnecessary, unconstitutional arrest by ICE.
Thank you. Let me just pause here for a minute. Are there any more questions from our attendees for Kaylee? Just want to take a minute to see if there's any other information in the chat or anybody who wishes to raise their hand. Ah, here we go. Taylor Netherland, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please? Taylor, I think you're on mute. Okay. Drake, can we unmute Taylor?
He was unmuted, but his volume was maybe off. Can you maybe unmute yourself again, Taylor, and then turn your volume up? That might help. Sometimes you have to reboot though, sorry.
Oh, he's Taylor's going to type in his question, so let's let him have an opportunity to do that.
While we're waiting, I'm going to put up the number up again and the Facebook name.
Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, just so folks have it and they can put it on their phones. Again, even if you're not directly impacted, you're just an ally, right? And you see ICE, you can call this number also. So it doesn't have to, you don't have to be a directly impacted person to call in.
Great, thank you. Taylor, we now see your question, which is, if we see ICE interacting with someone in the community other than recording, is there anything we can do to help ensure rights are being honored without interfering?
Yes. Again, I would probably call this line just because these folks are trained, right, to know how to interfere. They're trained legal observers. We have like lawyers on the team, right, like volunteer attorneys on the team. So I would just call this number, right, as to not put yourself at risk or anything like that. Recording is a great one to do, right, and also calling this line. So that's what I would say is the best way to keep yourself safe and to make sure that you're not interfering. So
Thank you. Brian Blakely is asking, how much cooperation have you gotten from local, municipal, and county officials?
yeah, actually, I'm lucky enough that I work all over the North region, right? So I've been able to see how chief of police have stepped up, right? So at least in Boulder County, I know they're respecting this, right? The fact that law enforcement does not collaborate with ICE, right? That they don't ask folks for their status. I know that's also the fact in Greeley. I know the chief of police recently came to a community meeting to basically state that, right? That he protects everyone and that they're not collaborating with ICE, unless of course ICE has some type of warrant or something, right? But they're not just asking people for immigration status. And I believe it's the same thing with Larimer County, although I haven't, actually talked to them personally. But so there's a lot of help. Yes, Andy, if you want to, yeah.
No, thanks. Not to
That's perfect. Yes.
But Sheriff Fayan has released a public statement on his Facebook page with his intention to comply with state law as it currently stands in relation to cooperation with ICE. So I think that's a very positive thing. And I know that our chief of police, Jeff Swoboda, has also signaled that they will continue to comply with state law. And also Poudre School District, quite frankly, has also had some community conversations around the same thing. And so I think those are very positive things in terms of protecting folks in our community and making sure that we're abiding by state law.
Thank you. Kaylee, a couple of comments for you from Susan Taylor, who is thanking you for making this information available to everyone. And then Mary Satre also appreciates learning the history of the immigrant rights in Colorado. It helps understand the present situation. Your presentation was very informative. Thank you so much.
Of course. And I did see a comment that I got directly to me. I'm sorry, I was speaking really fast. I was trying to get through all this information. Usually I slow it down. But if you do want a more like slow down version of it, there is going to be, I think we announced it at the start, but on February 27th, there's going to be a statewide version of this. On the 27th, there's a link to register to get the Zoom link. We're going to have attorneys at the end answering questions from folks, but it's going to be in English and Spanish. At least those are the languages confirmed that it's going to be in for that night.
Thank you. Let's have Carolyn Reed as our last question for this morning. Kaylee, what if ICE is outside of school waiting for student dismissal?
That gets complicated, right? Because you're not in a private area. And that's where we advise folks to, again, ask them, have I done something wrong? Am I free to leave, right? Am I free to leave is just a great question to ask to end any type of law enforcement interaction, right? It's just safer that way to make sure that you're not leaving, right, without their permission, right, that you're staying there. So we ask folks, of course, not to run away, right, because that can be used against them, right? So we ask them to stay there, to talk to them, right? But of course, don't answer questions, right? Unless they're like, like you're asking them, right? What have I done? Anything wrong? Am I free to leave? And then if they're telling you, no, you're not free to leave, stay silent. They may still detain you, right? Because it's a public area. ICE can technically enforce, right, immigration areas out in public areas. So we ask folks to just stay silent. And of course, call the line, have someone call an attorney. I'm going to put Romaine's hotline. This is their detention hotline. So if you have been detained or you know of a family member who was detained, call them, right? They have attorneys, again, they're pro bono, that can help out with the situation here. I'll type it in. I have it on here real quick. Again, this is for folks who are in detention. If you need an immigration attorney, that's different, right? These are specifically, they're trained for detention proceedings. So if you're like in the GEO center or you're in the process of deportation.
Great. Thank you, Kaylee. As you type that reference in, on behalf of all of us, we want to thank you for sharing your time and your expertise this morning on a very important topic. It was very effective. I want to thank our elected officials for organizing this issue forum and for all of you for attending. And one calendar note, there will be a local legislators town hall next Saturday, March 1st from 10 to 11:30 a.m. And it's going to be held at CSU at the Iris and Michael Smith Alumni Center in Event Hall, which is at 701 West Pitkin Street. So we hope to see all of you there. So thank you all for attending and hope you have a wonderful Saturday afternoon. Thank you.